I think we've all had those moments, thinking about how cool it would be to actually meet figures from history like George Washington, Socrates, dialogue with Albert Einstein or Harriet Tubman. Now we can. Inspired by Steve Allen's Meeting of Minds, on Living History we will conduct interviews with major historic figures and ask them what they think of our modern world. This episode has been carefully researched and reviewed by professional educators to ensure every opinion expressed by our guest is as accurate as possible. So it also should be noted, many historical figures born in a different time may have very different views and sometimes language to our own. You know, I'm just saying, they'd get canceled. And of course, all the opinions expressed do not belong to me, but as close as possible to the historical figures. I'm so excited to be able to present to you our first interview. The first time anyone has conducted an interview with this man since a cold afternoon on November 26th, 1963. President Kennedy, it's an honor to meet you.
Well, Casey, not only am I honored to be your first guest, but it is such a delight to be able to view the world in this great country as it exists here.
Well, Mr. President, we are so happy you're here. You know, something very interesting about your legacy is the week of your tragic assassination, you had a 58% approval rating. Today, you have the highest approval rating of any president since polls started in 1937 with 90%, likely in part due to your tragic fate. Since, obviously, you've never gotten the chance to discuss what happened on that sad day, I wonder if there's anything you'd like to say.
Well, Casey, that's a most serious question to be starting off with.
You're right, Mr. President. I apologize.
But when I agreed to come on your program, I promised you transparency and honesty. Now that I'm gone from this earth, and practically everything from my life has been written about, I wanted the chance to give my own perspective and not have it all written for me. Now, before I answer your question, I want you to know that in 1954, I fell into a coma and wasn't expected to survive the night. A priest came to the hospital to deliver, for the fourth time in my life, last rites. I had faced a lot of illness, such as Addison's disease, as is well known now. And in my presidency, we of course faced the existential threat of nuclear war. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Jackie told me she was prepared to stand by my side and watch the world end. So I had a number of encounters with my mortality. But the way I went was so shocking, so horrifying. I am revolted that the so-called Zapruder film has immortalized this moment. Furthermore, I had much left undone, and I was ripped away from my wife and children. But also, in the larger picture, that day was a tragedy for the country. Because my assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was a communist who aligned with our adversary, the Soviet Union. He unfortunately was also a mentally put upon individual who wanted attention. You see, he was intensely disappointed when newspapers didn't cover his return to the U.S. after he defected to the Soviet Union. He even considered assassinating an anti-communist American Army general before he targeted me. It is always tragic when a country's leader is killed. And that day also sadly disrupted the vision of my administration for the future of this country.
How so?
Well, Casey, you really are getting a lot out of me today. But as it has already been reported, when thinking about Vice President Johnson taking over the presidency, well, I was deeply concerned. I didn't think he had what it took to be president. And I'm sorry to say, it looks like I was right.
Really? Do you mean with regards to Vietnam?
Yes, I do. But let me be clear. I do believe we went into Vietnam on moral grounds. I was an advocate of Mr. Truman's domino theory, and if it wasn't for our intervention on the same grounds in Korea, there would be no South Korea today, and the brutal communism of Kim Jong-un would reign over the whole peninsula. However, I think it was devastating how many American sons we lost in that war. 58,000. Just for the Reds to take over anyway. As I said just before I died, in the final analysis, It was their war. They were the ones who had to win it or lose it. When Laos was in a similar situation, I refused to deploy American troops.
What about on civil rights?
In that respect, I believe President Johnson did a tremendous job, and I was happy to see him continue the work that began in my administration. And in a somewhat tragically ironic twist of fate, it was my assassination that led to the landslide for liberals in Congress that allowed so much of Johnson's agenda to be passed. Many of his Great Society programs were proposed under my New Frontier. However, I think Johnson was too soft on the CIA, an agency in much need of reform. It completely mishandled the Bay of Pigs intelligence, and I also learned that it tacitly tried to get Martin Luther King Jr. to commit suicide. Whatever the CIA has become thanks to J. Edgar Hoover, a man I never trusted, it is far from what President Truman intended, which was merely as an intelligence agency.
I see. Now, many people consider your family to be political royalty, and this was sort of intentional, was it not?
You see, my father, Joseph Kennedy, was an Irish Catholic. I understand your last president, another Joseph Biden, was elected president as a Catholic, and I'm pleased that not much stir was made over his religious affiliation. However, in my day, and even more so in my father's day, being an Irish Catholic at places like Harvard was not a quick route to popularity. In fact, my father was not accepted at any fraternity at Harvard, which was dominated by, as you now say, WASPs. This gave my already extraordinarily ambitious father a chip on his shoulder, and he groomed my older brother for the presidency practically from birth. But this story takes a dark turn. You see, when I was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for my actions in the Second World War, my brother became jealous and took on a very dangerous naval combat mission to try and achieve some glory of his own. My brother set up the bombs they were carrying for detonation, and just as he was about to eject himself from the plane, the bombs went off prematurely, and he died. The reason why the bombs went off is still not known today, and I never could forgive myself after Joseph passed. I carried that survivor's guilt for the rest of my life. The reason for this story is that after my brother passed, my father's political ambitions shifted to me, his eldest living son.
It must have been tough growing up with your dad.
No, let me stop you right there. My father was a good man, whom I had deep admiration for. When I was growing up, in the 1920s, fathers did not spend much time with their children. My dad did, even when I was always getting in trouble at school.
Right. Is it true you were going to be expelled from high school for filling the school gym with horse manure?
Wow. Biographers have really found everything, haven't they? Well, you must know, our headmaster had called Irish immigrants like my great-grandparents who only shovel horse manure, muckers. So we called ourselves the muckers and planned on filling the gymnasium with horse manure. And then our headmaster would have to be the mucker. But our plot was discovered, and my father had to talk him down from expulsion to a mere scolding.
That is... wow, I'm sure many listeners would not have known that you were in your pranking era.
My what?
Never mind. So today, getting into college is quite an onerous task for millions of kids across the country. We spend hours agonizing over our why us essays, having to write why each of the 21 colleges we're applying to is the only school for us. But you didn't exactly have this experience. I have the essay you wrote to get yourself into Harvard. If it's all right, I'd like to read it. You wrote, "The reasons I have for wishing to go to Harvard are several. I feel that Harvard can give me a better background and a better liberal education than any other university. I have always wanted to go there, as I have felt that it is not just another college, but is a university with something definite to offer. Then, too, I would like to go to the same college as my father. To be a Harvard man is an enviable distinction, and one that I sincerely hope I shall attain. Basically writing, it would sound cool to go to Harvard.
I said what I meant.
You know, Mr. President, many schools today are getting rid of legacy admissions.
Really? Why is that?
For fairness.
Well, that I can understand. However, I do think there is value in a son following in his father's footsteps at the same institution.
Of course, Mr. President. Now, sorry to bring up another touchy subject, but many in our modern time believe that your relationship with Jackie Kennedy was never truly one of love, but of convenience. That she was a wealthy scion who spoke 4 languages and made for a great, well, to put it bluntly, political accessory. Furthermore, many biographers say the true love of your life was Inga Arvad, the mistress of Adolf Hitler.
Those are serious charges. But I must confess, it is true. I loved Inga. And I told my father I will marry her. My father put an end to that. And now that it's known, I must say as well, I went on to live as a Don Juan. When I entered political office, however, most men in my time were married by 22. That I was 35 and a bachelor stirred up rumors. There was an article published that read, "The Senate's gay young bachelor." And Jackie did help in that regard, sure. And I do not deny that my relationship with Jackie was troubled. There were a couple times when she talked about divorce. But nonetheless, I loved Jackie, and she gave me 3 beautiful children.
Well, if I may, Mr. President, that's not all. In fact, Marilyn Monroe called Jackie Kennedy and said you would leave Jackie for her.
Well, I would never do a thing like that. And let me say another thing, young man. You seem to be quite ready to molest me for salacious details, or what you think may be the misdeeds of strong men like my father. But I'll say something that may not make it into the headlines or the biographies. I only got to where I was because of my father. I was never as systematic as he was. I graduated 65th of a class of 110. He built up our family from being low-class Irish Catholics to the presidency. I'll say that means something.
You're right. I apologize, Mr. President.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to come at you so forcefully. My father wasn't perfect. Actually, it was only for you inviting me on this program that I learned of the legacy of what happened to my sister.
Your sister?
Rosemary. I'm sorry. You see, my dear sister Rosemary was moderately retarded. She developed to the level of a 10-year-old. Now, when my political star began to rise, my father viewed her as a liability. And in order to avoid attracting negative attention, he had her lobotomized. And she regressed to the level of a toddler. My father hid her from the family for 20 years, and we didn't know what was done to her. When my dad had a stroke shortly before I died, we learned the truth. My sister Eunice was so moved by Rosemary's struggles, she created the Special Olympics. My brother Ted became an advocate for the intellectually disabled. And after I learned what happened to her, I signed the Mental Retardation Act, Community Mental Health Centers Act, and laid the groundwork for what later became the Americans with Disabilities Act. I was never able to see my sister Rosemary. When I met her, she wasn't Rosemary.
Wow, I'm sorry. I think you'll be glad to hear lobotomies are illegal now.
Right.
Well, I think one question many of our viewers are curious to hear your answer is, what do you think of the modern state of the country, Mr. President?
I am very glad to see the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the end of segregation. Similarly, I am happy to see man went to the moon in '69. I also marvel at the technological advances made in communication, television, and medicine. And it's good to see America still leading in those departments. But the country was not nearly as divided when I ran as it is today. It would have been unthinkable for families to be split over whether they voted for me or Mr. Nixon. In fact, I had donated to Mr. Nixon's campaign 10 years earlier. In our debate, we both praised each other and shared views on the most important issues of our time. Most importantly, taking a hard stance against communism. In regards to the present day, I am reminded of President Lincoln's quote from Scripture, "A house divided cannot stand." I urge all Americans to come together regardless of party.
Speaking of party, Mr. Kennedy, what do you make of the 2024 election?
Wouldn't you like to know? Well, in regards to Mr. Trump, I think he makes a good candidate for 1924. I think the way he speaks and demeans others, such as your war hero John McCain, are worthy of condemnation. That said, some of his policies make sense to me. You see, I signed what is called the first federal affirmative action bill, but it did not use racial quotas or preferences, but specifically prohibited consideration of those factors. I think quotas that existed in colleges before Mr. Trump are counterproductive and further divide our country along racial lines. I also praise Mr. Trump's work to help bring peace to the Middle East, which I am sad to see remains as violent now as it was in my time, through the Abraham Accords. However, I find it quite objectionable and honestly a bit disturbing that Mr. Trump refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. Do you know, Casey, that my opponent, Mr. Nixon, thought there might be enough voter fraud in the 1960 election that the election was stolen from him? However, he chose not to take any action for the sake of the country. As he begins his second term, I think it would be good for Mr. Trump to ask not what his country can do for him, but what he can do for his country.
And Kamala Harris?
Well, let me start by praising the progress in the country that a Negro woman can be nominated to the presidency. During my administration, we passed the first federal law that tried to make sure men and women received the same pay for the same work. Now, though I did cut taxes across the board, I was still a Keynesian. And I think some of her economic plans make sense to stimulate the economy through the use of social programs and middle-class tax cuts. And just like she supports, I implemented price controls to fight inflation. Just as I reprimanded President Trump for his divisiveness, I must add that the way Kamala Harris seems to support what President Joe Biden did in prosecuting a former president and trying to throw him in jail, that is not how things would be done in my day. I don't think it would be good for the country to see their leader or former leader in an orange jumpsuit. Though in this particular case, I'm not sure how you would be able to tell where the jumpsuit ends and the president begins.
Well, Mr. President, it would be a great asset to have your wisdom and wit with us today.
Well, it's good to see my family lives on in political life. My brother, Ted, and my brother Bobby, my brother-in-law Sergeant Shriver, and my nephew Bobby Kennedy Jr., just to name a few. But, with regards to my aforementioned nephew, it's sad to see my family split over politics when, in my day, to tell you the truth, we sort of had our political ambitions and party loyalty first, and some of the issues, well, they were negotiable.
Now, before we end, we have one question from one of our patrons. All right. Bob Pflugfelder asks, do you think you would have made space travel a national priority if Russia had not launched Sputnik?
That's an interesting question. And to be honest with you, I would have to say no. You see, when Sputnik launched in '58, the previous administration, under President Eisenhower, was taken by surprise. We Americans had naively assumed that we maintained supremacy in terms of weaponry, both nuclear and other kinds of arsenals, when compared to the progress of the Soviet Union. It sort of served as, to borrow another modern phrase, a wake-up call. And it was with this backdrop that the space race began, because we as Americans needed to prove our supremacy to the Soviet system, because we knew the threat that they posed to our country and to the world. With that in mind, I declared that the United States would deploy a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, and I'm so glad to see that we did. If we never had that impetus, I don't think we would have had the motivation to get a man on the moon as soon as we did, and I think the NASA programs would have stalled if they would have ever existed at all. Think about it. We got a man on the moon in less than 10 years. And in the 50 plus years since my administration, we have made very little progress comparatively with the rate of progress from those few years.
I see. Well, President Kennedy, thanks for being the first guest here on Living History. Is there any message you'd like to deliver to the Americans watching in 2024, most of whom look up to you?
Thank you, Casey. Yes. I would implore each and every one of you to remember how important this political experiment called the United States of America is to liberty both here and abroad. Since it was founded, each generation of Americans has been summoned to give testimony to its national loyalty. The graves of young Americans who answered the call to service surround the globe. Now, it's your turn to fight for what is right, to be of service to your country, just as I tried to do in my own time. I ask that you prepare yourselves to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty. It is not my country anymore. It is yours.
Wow. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Casey.
Thank you for watching, and thank you, President Kennedy, for being our first guest. If you want to help us decide the next guest, if you just believe in what we're doing here, or you want to ask our next guest a question, join us on Patreon. This is all possible thanks to our generous patrons. Either way, I'm so glad you joined us for the first episode of Living History. I hope you learned about JFK, and I hope you got to know him as a person, because that's what we're trying to do here. He really was a fascinating character, lived an interesting life. Horrible what happened to his sister, and you sort of got to see some of the motivations behind how he became president, what his dad was driven by, wanting to prove himself, being rejected for being Irish Catholic, and how that all played into the story behind how we have the 35th president we all know today. So, looking forward to hearing from you, and I'll see you next time.